Hi guys, Freddy here. Welcome back to another Satanic Panic video, although it's kinda not. Because recently I was on Facebook and the BBC Archive released this.
Playing a role, pretending to be someone else, is, as any child will tell you, a fascinating pastime. But now it's become a craze that's sweeping the southeast, thanks to a game known to its fans as D&D.
First up, I've got to pay the praises of the BBC Archive. It's a fantastic resource split over Facebook and YouTube, where they put up clips from the 70 years the BBC has been operating. Now these are clips from news, documentaries, interviews, that kind of thing. For geeks, it's absolutely brilliant because there's a lot of space news in there, lots of science news, looking at electric cars in the 1960s and stuff like that. Early versions of AI. But there's also an interview with cult figures, some of the cast of Star Trek from the late 70s, early 80s get interviewed. And delving into subjects like Dungeons and Dragons. Now this itself is a story from BBC Southeast. And to explain for people who don't know, the BBC, while it's the national broadcaster of the United Kingdom and covers the entire country, it also has local news stories. So up here in Scotland, we've got BBC Scotland. And the main news breaks away to stories local. Now this was for the southeast. Now while London is in the southeast, London's counted as its own area, so it would have its own BBC London. Southeast would be the area around London. And this is a story that they've recorded for that about a business done good. And that's the direction they're taking it from. But let's carry on watching.
Now, D&D stands for Dungeons and Dragons, a fantasy game that's something of a cross between a hobby and a cult. It gives children and grown-ups the chance to get away from it all, playing it being knights in shining armour, enchantresses, wizards or medieval monks. A spellbinding game where taking part is more important than winning.
Now, watching this, I was looking for the biases of the time, because this is from a broadcast in 1983, so it's right in the middle of the Satanic Panic, when that was happening in America. So I was looking for how the British were reacting to the same thing, and he's using phrases like cult. So there seems to be some bias involved in here. But then he mentions it's a spellbinding game, and he does a fairly decent description of Dungeons and Dragons. So I decided to continue watching.
Well, Mike Donkin has been discovering how this dream world is now becoming very big business.
So this is where we really see the bias of the BBC coming into it. Because this isn't about this being a culty game which influences kids. This is about it being a profitable business. Because this is the early 80s, and profit was everything in Margaret Thatcher's Britain. Very right-wing stuff, and if you were making money, then they really didn't care about anything else, and the BBC was focusing in on that.
Let's just wander around the edge of the balcony and look at the treasure chest.
Life isn't always dull and workaday in the suburbs.
I'm not going to look at the Gorgon, but I'm going to turn around so I'm facing into the room a bit, so I can actually sort of see if any of these statues start to move.
In this South London sitting room, they're playing a game that has thousands of devotees under its spell, Dungeons and Dragons. It's one of a new cult of fantasy role-playing games. The world you venture into is a dungeon mapped out on paper.
The intrepid goblin killer.
Now, while the presenter is still using phrases like cult, the thing I noticed more about that was two of the faces I recognise, because that's Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone. Now, while they're more probably famous for founding Games Workshop and the titan that it is now in gaming, to me, they're more famous as the guys who wrote the fighting fantasy game books. And those were the things which got me into gaming. Because I didn't have friends who had Dungeons and Dragons at first, I picked up the game books and got into it through that.
Each player assumes the character of a tiny painted figure in an adventure that takes him into the heroic, the macabre, and often the very gory,
Blindly stabbing in the dark,
reaching parts that other games don't reach.
Okay, and while that's not a perfect description of Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy role-playing, it's not too bad. And they go on to correct it by giving time to Steve Jackson himself.
Well, they're not at all like other games, and there are no boards, there's no winners or losers. There isn't really an end to the game. And because there isn't very much equipment, or there doesn't have to be very much equipment, the whole game does go on in your mind. Well, people did call us cranks in the early days until they started seeing how popular the whole thing was. I mean, this was sort of labelled a 3-month wonder. Everybody thought that fantasy games were for kids, it was all about fairy stories. and that people ought to be playing the more serious war games. But in fact, they've been shown to be completely wrong, because fantasy games are now a lot more popular than war games ever were.
And so they're keeping it very business focused here. This isn't about fantasy role-playing and the effects it's having on people, although there are mentions of that, and they are presenting fantasy role-playing in a very positive light. But it's being put in a positive light because this is a story of local guys done good. These local guys have opened up a business, they're creating stores across the country, they are dominating the industry and making money.
Steve Jackson and Ian Livingston don't just play these games, they profit from them. 8 years ago, they threw in their regular jobs and slept in the back of a van as they struggled to make the stuff of dreams a saleable commodity. Now this fantasy factory turns out boxed games and models which they sell in their own shops in London, Manchester, Birmingham and Sheffield. The turnover is extraordinary.
So showing the guys pulling up in their Porsche, talking about outstanding profits, spreading across the country, this is totally business focused. But from a gamer, it's a fascinating look into the offices of Games Workshop circa 1983. You know, that looks like a fantastic place. It looks like it's been set up by gamers for gamers. A fun place to work and play as well. Definitely different to the corporate monolith it's become these days.
Penguin have published a series of games books written by Steve and Ian, and all of them have topped the children's bestseller lists. And there's a magazine called White Dwarf, with a circulation of 20,000. Its readers trade ideas and run fantasy championships and conventions.
I'm afraid, Joe, that I'm going to attack you.
Even staff at the Games Workshop seem gripped. When the production line stops for lunch, it's workers' playtime.
I do love the way they make it out that when it stops for lunch, it's workers' playtime. Or it could be called play testing, because testing a game before putting it out is very important. And that's kind of what they were doing by employing gamers. They were getting them to work through their lunchtime without really knowing it, and people didn't care because they were getting to game.
I like the challenge of setting up an entire world with its own laws, peculiar religions, races, reasons for fighting each other, reasons for liking each other.
But you play them to the bitter end, don't you?
Yes, to the bitter end. Many of our game sessions last many hours, 18, 20 hours is not unheard of. But they're riveting during that session, they're riveting and you lose all track of time.
And like so many gamers, playing for many hours at a time. I remember in my teenage years, my early 20s, maybe even up to my 30s, where we would play from a Saturday night through to a Sunday lunchtime. We would play for 20 hours at a time because we were young, single, lacking responsibilities, and we could do that. Now we're grown-up grumps with families. We can't do that anymore, so it's been cut way down. But that's Gary Chalk and Joe Dever, creators of the Lone Wolf game books. These are absolutely massive names in British fantasy. Not only have we had Steve Jackson and Ian Livingston, now Gary Chalk and Joe Dever. Amazing.
I get on the train and go home. Very often I sit there and make up adventures as I go home. I just sit and write them out, try out different plots, invent new characters. And by the time I've got off about an hour and a half later, I've usually got something that I actually keep and develop very often later on the same evening.
Do you ever escape into real life?
Not if I can possibly avoid it, no. No, real life is quite horrible. This is much better.
Gary Chalk there sharing a story that I've seen from countless authors and things who have to have real jobs to support them while they're writing until they start to make a profit from their books. But they will use their commute time to write. I've seen so many people who have to travel for an hour or more on the train, just taking their laptop, writing for that time, then editing when they get home. Because obviously writing on a busy commuter train isn't the best stuff. But it's just wasted time in your day that you're doing nothing else with, so you can be creative and turn that into a positive thing.
How much does it take people over? Does it get into their minds and does it grip them?
Well, only totally. Some people become completely obsessed and they do it for hours and then they play it for whole weekends. And it's so unique in its appeal because you don't know what's going to happen.
With this empire of yours now, though, is a lot of the pleasure just watching the checks roll in.
It's certainly not reached that stage yet, because we started the business off as our hobby. This was our hobby, and we thought, well, I don't know, let's see if we can have a go at making it a business. Really, the whole thing of business is like a game. I mean, it is a game in itself, like Monopoly.
This entire section of floor swings
It's
up
what?
into the wall.
It's like one of these new beds that go into the wall.
These two have disappeared from view.
And so that's the end of the piece. And it's amazingly positive. I was very, very surprised. Now, while in this series I've been focusing more on the religious aspects, American news, the mainstream media, did pick up on that as well, and did treat Dungeons & Dragons as a scary game, because they were getting their feeds directly from things like Patricia Pulling's Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons. Whereas this BBC article treats it far more as it's a successful business. These local guys have founded a business, they're employing people, they're spreading across the country. That's a good thing. They're being successful. They're doing business. Now, while Dungeons & Dragons itself might be a bit of a quirky game, it might be a bit weird, and grown-ups, adults playing games is a bit odd, but they're successful, so generally this is a very positive thing. Where in America, they treated that as a danger. You know, Gary Gygax and TSR were making $20 million a year, I seem to remember, round about the same period, and that was negative. They're profiting out of corrupting our kids. This is bad. Now, I find that very odd, because the general opinion of America is that it's more accepting of people being successful. America's built on people creating businesses and being successful and making money. Whereas Britain can be a bit down on people. If you're successful, you can be looked down upon because you're seen somehow as getting your hands corrupted by dirty money. There's definitely a look from the working class that people shouldn't go above their station and found businesses. But I just found it to be such a reversal that America's looking down on people running businesses, whereas Britain was looking up to them and holding them up as being successful guys doing good. But anyway, as usual, I've whittled on for quite long enough, so thank you very much for watching. But as always, most of all, you look after yourselves, and I'll catch you later. Bye now.